From Randy Couture, who complained about the treatment of fighters in the organization.
I think I was one of the only guys, or the first guy, to stand up.
To Francis Ngannou, who was fed up with the payment structure.
I don't want to sign my life to somebody who doesn't give me something else in return.
In this video, we're looking at UFC legends who have openly shared their issues with today's UFC. Francis Ngannou. Let's start with the man who might just be the most physically imposing heavyweight champion the UFC has ever crowned in its entire history. Francis Ngannou, standing at an intimidating 6 feet 4 inches tall with knockout power that scientists at a performance institute have literally measured and recorded as the hardest punch ever documented in human history. Ngannou was supposed to be the UFC's golden goose for years and years to come. The Cameroonian-born powerhouse represented everything the promotion could want in a heavyweight champion. Devastating knockouts, an incredible personal story of overcoming poverty, and mainstream crossover appeal. Instead, his departure in 2023 became one of the most contentious, bitter, and publicly acrimonious exits in UFC history. Now, you might naturally think that a reigning, defending, undisputed heavyweight champion of the world would be sitting pretty, cashing massive checks and enjoying the fruits of his labor without a care in the world. But according to Ngannou himself, the reality of his situation was far, far different from what fans might imagine. His frustrations centered on what he perceived as low pay relative to the enormous revenues his fights were generating for the company, contract terms that severely restricted his ability to pursue lucrative boxing opportunities, and a complete lack of fighter protections like basic health insurance.
I was frustrated of how they were treating me. Because I didn't want to sign a contract, and that I felt like they were using that power against me. This contract is up. I don't have it. I don't want to sign my life to somebody who doesn't give me something else in return. He doesn't have any responsibility. He can decide whenever he wants and cut you, and he's not even obligated to give you fight.
Dana White claimed repeatedly in media appearances that he offered Ngannou the highest paid heavyweight contract in UFC history, but Ngannou rejected it outright because of what he saw as exploitative clauses buried deep within the fine print, provisions that would limit his freedom and autonomy as an athlete.
It's very simple. In boxing, they have to negotiate. It's open. There is two sides.
It's open.
Here,
it's not one company.
Here is a company. There is one company who owns both fighters. You and your opponent.
It's a conflict of interest. I don't even know if that's legal.
So it's just you guys. Okay, you guys are fighting. You're fighting
is
that
that,
guy. You're
is
fighting
that
that
legal?
guy.
And here's the thing that makes this story even more remarkable and eye-opening. After leaving the UFC behind, Ngannou earned over $30 million, combined fighting Tyson Fury and Anthony Joshua in the boxing ring, plus his subsequent PFL deal, which was reportedly more than he'd made in his entire UFC career combined. But the pay dispute was just part of the story. In November 2025, things took a dramatic turn when Dana White publicly accused Ngannou of grabbing him by the shirt and pushing him during a dispute over a denied $50,000 bonus. White also claimed that Ngannou had collared UFC executive Hunter Campbell during the same confrontation. The UFC president later clarified that it was more like Ngannou placing a hand on his chest to continue an argument rather than outright violence. When Ngannou appeared on the Ariel Helwani show, he responded somewhat evasively, calling the accusations disappointing and noting that UFC headquarters likely had cameras that could verify what actually happened. He expressed regret over the deteriorated relationship, but the damage was done. By December 2025, amid rumors of Ngannou's PFL contract expiring and fan interest in a Jon Jones super fight, White rejected any possibility of Ngannou's return, saying, "Nothing made me happier than throwing that guy over to the PFL and labeling Ngannou a bad guy." The message was crystal clear: once you challenge the UFC's authority, there's no coming back. Darren Till. If there's one fighter who has been brutally honest about the UFC's sponsorship policies, it's Darren Till. The British welterweight turned middleweight has repeatedly and passionately called out what he sees as exploitative practices that have directly impacted his earning potential. Till has repeatedly called the UFC's 2014 Reebok apparel deal cruel, arguing that it restricted fighters from individual sponsorships on their fight gear, replacing potentially lucrative deals with tiered payouts that didn't come close to compensating for the losses. Before the Reebok deal, fighters could earn significant income by displaying sponsor logos during walkouts and fights. That revenue stream was suddenly cut off. The shift to centralized sponsorships left fighters unable to earn extra income, severely hurting their overall compensation. When the UFC replaced Reebok with Venom in 2021, many hoped things would improve, but Till and others saw the changes as marginal at best. In 2024, Till revealed that he had turned down six-figure sponsorships due to Venom's exclusivity requirements, tying it to broader pay complaints and questioning what was going on with UFC business decisions. What makes Till's story particularly poignant is the contrast between his early career promise and his eventual departure. During his UFC run, Till was hailed as the future by Dana White and fans alike, with White posting enthusiastically about him. But but feeling undervalued led Till to transition to boxing, where he now identifies primarily as a boxer rather than a mixed martial artist. Till claimed that White tried to talk him out of certain risky fights, contributing to his frustrations about career direction. Recent social media posts in 2025 quote Till saying, "People were loving me, but right now I'm a boxer," highlighting how sponsorship policies and feeling undervalued pushed him away from the sport he once dominated. Demetrious Johnson. If Francis Ngannou's story is fundamentally about heavyweight drama and allegations of physical confrontations in corporate offices, then Demetrious Johnson's grievances paint a picture of something far more systematic and institutionalized: the deliberate, calculated undervaluation of technical excellence and athletic brilliance in favor of raw marketability and entertainment value. Mighty Mouse, as he's affectionately known throughout the mixed martial arts community, accomplished something that many historians and analysts consider the single greatest achievement in UFC history: an absolutely unprecedented 11 consecutive title defenses as flyweight champion. Let that sink in for a moment. 11 straight successful defenses of his world championship. He was, by virtually every conceivable metric and measurement available, the most dominant, consistent, and technically brilliant champion the promotion had ever seen grace the inside of the octagon. And yet, the UFC's treatment of him throughout his record-breaking reign tells a very different story about what the organization truly values. Johnson's complaints centered squarely on the UFC's steadfast refusal to grant pay-per-view points to flyweight champions and the demonstrably poor promotion of his historically dominant reign. And when Dana White was asked about this disparity in promotional effort and financial reward, his response was brutally, refreshingly honest. He flat out admitted that lighter weight divisions simply don't sell to the mainstream audience. But here's where the numbers get truly shocking, where this story transforms from frustrating to genuinely infuriating for anyone who cares about fair compensation. Johnson revealed that he earned just $14,000 for a 2011 title fight against the legendary Dominic Cruz. $14,000 for a world championship fight on a major pay-per-view card. And despite multiple formal requests for PPV points over the years, the UFC's response was always exactly the same: "We do not give pay-per-view points to flyweight guys." What made this particularly galling for Johnson was watching newcomers like CM Punk, a professional wrestler with zero MMA experience, earning $500,000 plus incentives for his UFC debut. Johnson had defended the belt 8 times by that point, proving his worth over and over again, and yet a celebrity crossover was valued exponentially more. Johnson also accused White of lying about contract details and using bullying tactics, like threatening to dissolve the entire flyweight division if Johnson refused certain fights. The pressure was immense, and eventually Johnson had enough. In 2018, the UFC traded Johnson to one championship in exchange for Ben Askren, a move that felt dismissive to many observers. But here's the twist: Johnson thrived at one, winning titles and crediting the move as the best decision of his career. After retiring in 2024, Johnson expressed no animosity toward the UFC, but continued to highlight the systemic biases against smaller weights and technical excellence over marketability. Tyron Woodley. Tyron Woodley's complaints against the UFC touch on something that many fighters have been reluctant to discuss publicly: allegations of racial bias in promotion and title opportunities. Woodley held the welterweight championship from 2016 to 2020, successfully defending his belt multiple times against elite competition. And yet, according to Woodley, he was constantly subjected to public disrespect from Dana White, who labeled his fights boring despite his dominant performances. In 2017, Woodley made waves when he accused the UFC and fans of racial prejudice, stating on ESPN that black fighters face barriers to stardom. White's response was to call Woodley a drama queen and deny any racial issues in the organization, insisting that Woodley's fan problems stemmed from his personality rather than his race. Woodley elaborated in subsequent interviews, explaining his comments on racism in MMA as rooted in unequal treatment compared to white counterparts. The tension reached a boiling point after UFC 214 in 2017, when Woodley demanded an apology from White for criticizing his unanimous decision win over Demian Maia as lackluster. White refused and continued to downplay Woodley's marketability.
I was gonna leave the UFC after Darren Till. I said, "Cut me, dog. Y'all want me here, man? Shit, y'all keep holding on to me, dog. Like we fight because you know how I was. I was a gorilla. I knew the numbers so well. I knew what everybody was making. I'm not finna go out there and be making the same as Cowboy Cerrone. That motherfucker never touched gold in his life."
In April 2025, Woodley revealed that his 2018 diss track, "I'll Beat Yo Age How It Sounds," was actually targeted at Dana White, highlighting their rocky relationship. By December 2025, Woodley explained his UFC fallout, attributing it to persistent undervaluation and bias that limited his earnings and legacy recognition. Tito Ortiz. Now let's rewind the clock and travel back to the early days of the UFC to talk about one of the organization's original, undeniable superstars, Tito Ortiz, the self-proclaimed Huntington Beach bad boy. Before Conor McGregor became a household name, before Brock Lesnar brought crossover WWE fans to the sport, before any of the modern-era pay-per-view draws emerged, there was Tito Ortiz, a brash, confident light heavyweight champion who helped put the UFC on the map during its darkest, most uncertain days when the company was struggling just to survive. The legendary feud between Ortiz and Dana White is the stuff of MMA folklore at this point, stretching all the way back to the early 2000s, when Ortiz, as the reigning and defending light heavyweight champion and one of the company's biggest stars, held out for higher compensation after massive draws like his fight against Ken Shamrock. White's response to Ortiz's demands was characteristically blunt and unforgiving. He publicly called Ortiz greedy, selfish, and stupid for not accepting what was offered. According to White's telling of events, Ortiz would repeatedly threaten to pull out of fights at the last minute for extra money, and was constantly stepping over dollars to pick up dimes, prioritizing short-term gains over long-term relationship building. Ortiz, on the other hand, maintained consistently that he was being treated unfairly and disrespectfully after helping build the UFC's popularity during a time when the company was hemorrhaging money and fighting for its very survival.
Most of the guys who are doing the absolute worst are not in a position that they could say publicly, I have a second job, I'm borrowing money from my parents.
Right.
I know so many fighters that are living in the Jackson's MMA gym because they can't afford to have their own apartment. And they're UFC fighters.
They just fought.
So this is sad. And if I have to have a bad relationship with Dana, sit out for 2 years, 3 years, to bring light to what's happening, then
Their mutual animosity reached its absolute peak with a planned 2007 boxing match between the two men, promoter versus fighter, boss versus employee, that ultimately collapsed before it could happen. Ortiz later revealed the stunning reason why he withdrew, explaining that the contract offered him $0 despite verbal promises of a 50-50 split, calling the entire situation a lose-lose that was designed to humiliate him. White countered with his own version of events, claiming that Ortiz simply backed out because he was genuinely afraid of losing to the UFC president in the ring. But perhaps the most explosive allegation came from White himself, who recounted a full-blown fistfight on a private plane to Japan, where Ortiz allegedly applied a neck crank until White punched his ribs to escape. Ortiz had a different version of events, claiming he manhandled White until the UFC boss cried uncle. After leaving the UFC in 2008 citing poor treatment, Ortiz faced minimal promotion upon his return and was effectively blacklisted after competing for rival organizations. When Ortiz finally retired in 2012, White expressed relief, calling him washed up. As recently as 2023, White blasted Ortiz for trying to destroy the company through his contract holdouts. The bad blood, it seems, never really went away. Randy Couture. Speaking of legends from the pioneering early days of mixed martial arts, Randy Couture's criticisms of the UFC carry absolutely enormous weight, not just because of his Hall of Fame credentials and his unprecedented achievement of winning multiple world championships across 2 different weight classes, but because his complaints and public statements helped spark a much broader, more serious conversation about fighter rights, fair compensation, and organizational accountability that continues to reverberate throughout the sport to this very day. In 2007, Couture made national headlines when he took the extraordinary step of publicly resigning as the reigning heavyweight champion of the world, citing inadequate pay compared to the organization's booming revenues and a complete lack of transparency in how earnings were calculated and distributed. He held a dramatic press conference accusing the UFC of systematically mistreating its fighters and deliberately withholding financial details that athletes had every right to know, an incredibly bold, career-risking move at a time when the UFC was becoming a mainstream cultural phenomenon, and challenging the company's authority could mean professional exile. Couture claimed that his salary was far, far below what top-tier stars of his caliber genuinely deserved based on the revenue they generated. The UFC publicly rebutted his assertions with specific figures they released to the media, citing $1,186,000 for UFC 68. But Couture emphasized repeatedly that there was no signing bonus in his contract and that Dana White had made what he described as envelope payments, a portrayal of his treatment that he found deeply disrespectful and demeaning for an athlete of his stature. As an older fighter competing at the highest levels well into his 40s, Couture highlighted how veteran athletes were being exploited through exclusive contracts that severely limited external opportunities, while facing mounting medical costs from years of accumulated damage without any organizational support. His passionate push for better fighter welfare, health benefits, and post-career support was decades ahead of its time.
By the UFC, by the promotion I fought for most of my career, I would have to say no.
Why?
Because it's personal with Dana. I've never
Were you too
had
big?
I think I was one of the only guys, or the first guy, to stand up had representation and management that understood what ancillary rights were and all these things that they're sliding into these contracts, and we fought for that stuff, and they didn't like it. I was never one of the boys, never one that would just sign it all over and let them do whatever they wanted. I wanted to control my own destiny. I saw myself as a brand and fought hard for some of that stuff, and they didn't like that.
The feud intensified over ancillary rights, with Couture standing up against UFC contracts that claimed perpetual rights to his likeness, leading to lawsuits and the UFC suing him to prevent competing elsewhere. In a 2024 podcast, Couture revealed having his rights taken away by the UFC, amplifying calls for unionization in ongoing antitrust suits. Perhaps most damning is the accusation that White has systematically erased Couture from UFC history due to these disputes. Observers have noted his exclusion from promotional materials despite his Hall of Fame status. Recent discussions on social media in 2025 have referenced White using Couture's treatment as an intimidation tactic against other fighters, with posts calling it sinister and noting efforts to delete him like a terrible person. Nate Diaz. Nate Diaz is one of the most beloved and enigmatic figures in UFC history, a trash-talking, no-nonsense Stockton native who has never been afraid to speak his mind. And when it comes to criticizing the UFC, Diaz has a long and complicated history. His early complaints centered on underpayment despite his role in massive pay-per-view events like UFC 196 and 202 against Conor McGregor. In 2014, Diaz broke his silence on money issues, claiming that UFC's sponsorship restrictions were crimping his earnings. Dana White's response was that Diaz needed to fight more if he wanted to fix his financial situation. Diaz also criticized UFC business practices for limiting fighter income through rigid contracts and promotional obligations that he often refused to fulfill. This led to public spats where White called Diaz difficult and undeserving of top billing. His dissatisfaction peaked around his 2022 exit when he started his own promotion after feeling undervalued. But here's the thing, Diaz made White eat his words by proving his drawing power with the McGregor upset and rejecting a UFC deal after his victory. Tensions between them even nearly escalated into a physical confrontation at the UFC 196 press conference, requiring security intervention. But here's where Diaz's story takes an unexpected turn. By 2024, his views had evolved considerably. In interviews, Diaz actually defended White against fighter pay critics, stating that the UFC boss gets a fucking bad rap, and suggesting that people misunderstand money in the sport. He still acknowledged past frustrations, but showed a more nuanced perspective. In 2025, Diaz expressed interest in a McGregor trilogy at the UFC White House event, with fans speculating it could be the biggest fight in UFC history. His relationship with the UFC remains complicated, a mixture of past grievances and evolved understanding. Anderson Silva. Anderson Silva is widely considered by fans, analysts, and fellow fighters alike the greatest middleweight champion in UFC history, holding the record for the longest consecutive title reign the promotion has ever witnessed. His highlight reel knockouts that seem to defy the laws of physics, and his matrix-like defensive skills that made opponents look like amateurs swinging at shadows. These attributes combine to make Silva an undeniable legend whose name will forever be synonymous with MMA excellence. But even legends of this magnitude have grievances, frustrations, and stories of mistreatment to share. Silva's complaints include Dana White's repeated and public criticism of his entertaining but highly controversial fighting style, particularly his well-documented tendency to taunt, mock, and showboat against opponents during fights. At UFC 112 in 2010, White blasted Silva's performance against Demian Maia as profoundly disappointing due to what he perceived as excessive and disrespectful showboating, despite Silva winning the fight, calling it one of the most embarrassing performances he'd ever witnessed in his years running the UFC, and even threatening to cut Silva from the roster entirely.
Professional sports isn't a job. It's an opportunity, right? You were given an opportunity. You were good enough to get an opportunity where you could go out in a very short
period of time
and make as much money as you could possibly make, and it gave you a platform to be here today having this conversation.
Yeah.
That is what professional sports is all about.
As Silva aged into his 40s following his devastating leg injury in the 2013 rematch with Chris Weidman, he felt increasingly dismissed and disregarded by the very promotion he had helped define. When Silva transitioned to boxing and fought internet celebrity Jake Paul in 2022, White expressed complete and utter indifference to the matchup, stating publicly that he didn't care about the legend's post-UFC pursuits or career decisions. In interviews around that time period, Silva alleged poor treatment from the promotion throughout his later years, claiming White fundamentally lacked respect for his contributions despite his record-breaking reign. By December 2025, Silva voiced concerns about a different matter entirely, White's ambitious Zuffa boxing plans, questioning the UFC boss's stated intent to alter the Ali Act, and urging the combat sports community to respect the traditions and existing structure of boxing. Despite defending White against some recent criticism from other fighters, Silva's history illustrates how the UFC handles aging icons, often prioritizing the cultivation of new talent over the welfare and legacy of the veterans who built the sport. Notably, Silva received a $10.3 million payout from the UFC antitrust settlement in September 2025, a substantial testament to just how widespread and legitimate the grievances against UFC's business practices truly are. Wanderlei Silva. Wanderlei Silva's criticisms of the UFC represent some of the most dramatic confrontations in the sport's history, culminating in lawsuits, a lifetime ban, and eventual reconciliation. Silva's complaints centered on exploitative sponsorship policies that required promoters to pay hefty fees before backing fighters and inadequate overall pay. In 2014, Silva accused the UFC of being show-off promoters and biased, highlighting how sponsors had to fork over $50,000 to the organization before they could even back a fighter. White countered these accusations by revealing that Silva had earned $9.7 million during his UFC career, calling his complaints unfounded. After Silva evaded a drug test in 2014 and received a lifetime ban, the feud escalated. The UFC sued Silva for defamation over his accusations of manipulation, leading to his release in 2016 following a social media apology. White accused Silva of using a smokescreen with retirement announcements to dodge accountability, while Silva pushed for fighter unionization amid antitrust concerns. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. In July 2024, Silva admitted ingratitude toward White and the UFC, stating in Portuguese that he spit on the plate that fed me, reflecting on his past complaints as misguided. His 2024 Hall of Fame induction came despite the ban, with reports joking that White had forgotten about the lifetime suspension. Cung Le. Up next is Cung Le, a former Strikeforce champion and UFC middleweight contender whose grievances against the organization bridge the gap between personal exploitation and the industry-wide antitrust concerns that ultimately shook the entire foundation of the UFC's business model and resulted in one of the largest legal settlements in combat sports history. Lee's complaints highlighted exploitative treatment in non-fighting capacities, particularly his role as mentor on the Ultimate Fighter China television program in 2013 to 2014, where he was paid a mere $5,000 per episode despite having to completely reroute and postpone a planned fight against Michael Bisping in order to accommodate the UFC's aggressive international expansion needs and marketing strategies. Lee recounted being forced to relocate to China abruptly and without adequate notice, with Dana White personally mandating his participation as a company man who needed to represent the organization's interests. There was absolutely no negotiation on pay. He was told in no uncertain terms to accept what was offered or sit on the bench and watch his career stagnate. The filming delays and production issues that inevitably arose meant weeks without work while trapped thousands of miles away from his family and support network. Compounding this already difficult situation, Le had to leave for China immediately after his wife underwent surgery, leaving her hospitalized for an entire week with no one to adequately care for their young children. The UFC's complete lack of flexibility for personal emergencies and family situations underscored its apparent prioritization of business objectives over the fundamental welfare and humanity of its contracted athletes. But Le's most significant and lasting contribution to the broader fight for fighter rights came through his role as lead plaintiff in the landmark antitrust class action lawsuit that would reshape the industry. The Cung Le et al. Zuffa LLC case, filed in December 2014, accused the UFC of exercising illegal monopsony power through exclusive long-term contracts, strategically acquiring rival promotions, and systematically suppressing fighter pay to approximately 20% of total revenues, a figure dramatically below what athletes in other major professional sports leagues typically receive. The suit alleged potential damages up to $1.6 billion when trebled under antitrust law, with evidence from depositions of top executives like Dana White and Lorenzo Fertitta, revealing tactics deliberately designed to maintain market dominance and suppress competition. After a decade-long legal battle that seemed at times like it might never conclude, the case finally settled in September 2024 for $375 million, distributing funds to over 1,200 fighters without any admission of wrongdoing by the UFC or its ownership. Lee's experiences exemplify how the UFC prioritized aggressive business growth and expansion over individual fighter welfare, fueling broader calls for systematic reform throughout the sport. Thank you for watching this video. If you'd like to watch another fascinating video like this, click on one of the boxes on your screen right now.